So in the name of freedom of speech and democracy from the civilized world, RT is being banned across the Western world, so you can't hear this perspective.
The state-owned Russia Today and Sputnik, as well as their subsidiaries, will no longer be able to spread their lies to justify Putin's war and to sow division in our union.
But whilst you can hear this video for now, it's time to talk about some of the ways in which the West is completely hypocritical and why we should question them when they're advocating a so-called anti-war position. First of all, within the same 24 hours that the war in Ukraine had started, the West, meaning Israel and the United States, had struck 3 different countries in the Middle East and Africa, which nobody in the Western world really knew about, let alone cared about. These 3 countries were Syria, which Israel struck unprovoked, violating its sovereignty, a violation of international law. Also, the United States of America bombarded Yemen and Somalia in that same time period. And Western media not only have not really covered these events at all, but on top of that have brought people in, like Condoleezza Rice, for instance, who was part of the Bush administration, which illegally invaded Iraq, resulting in around 1 million deaths and millions of people fleeing that country, to condemn war crimes. This really can't be made up.
I've argued that when you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order, and that's why throwing the book at them now.
And it's not just former Bush administration officials who are being rolled out on Western television, whether it be Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, or even the BBC and other outlets in the West who advocate an anti-war position, themselves being war criminals. And really, it seems so far that these figures haven't been as bad as some of the reporters and news anchors in Western media in general, in terms of the language that they are using to describe this conflict. We're hearing things like the civilized world is now being attacked, or so-called civilized countries are being attacked, people with blonde hair and blue eyes are being attacked, therefore we should care more about them because of the fact that this is happening in Europe to Europeans, or that it's happening to a so-called civilized country.
This isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Yeah, well, just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white, they're very similar to many people who live in Poland.
For me, I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
And as offensive as this sort of language and coverage is to people who are not white and Western themselves, it sets an extremely dangerous precedent talking about the so-called free world and the so-called civilized world, because when you have a situation where war is ongoing, it is blasted through the television screens 24/7, emotions are up through the roof, the people in the West are being subjected to a form of propaganda, and this is not just the case when it comes to Russia. We've seen this in the past with other examples when it comes to going to war with Iraq, for instance, or going to war in Afghanistan, that suddenly the government of a country does not become the only target, but the people of that country also. And now this seems to be coming through very blatantly. Take a look at this clip, for instance, of Hillary Clinton talking about how to deal with Russia.
Pose enough economic pain on Putin and, sadly, the Russian people, combined with providing weapons, that might be the only way.
So Hillary Clinton's point of view, and this is a woman, by the way, who is in large part responsible for the complete destruction of Libya, the NATO invasion of Libya, which has turned it into a failed state at this point and caused a refugee crisis.
Yes, we came We saw he died.
And that's not the only war she was involved in, that in order to save one people, we have to attack, destroy, possibly kill another people. And see, when former Washington officials like Hillary Clinton, whose husband, for instance, introduced the sanctions against Iraq, which starved to death 500,000 children, are saying these sort of things openly, and when we start to accept this sort of propaganda, which paints people outside of the Western world as basically barbarians, as people who are led by Hitler-like figures, and who are dressing differently to us, speaking differently to us, maybe have different religious views to us, it is extremely dangerous. And the worst part of this all is there is ample examples in the past of the West doing the exact same thing against its enemies.
And what they needed to see was American boys and girls going house to house, from Basra to Baghdad, and basically saying, well, suck on this.
We could track this back to Vietnam and how the Vietnamese were portrayed to Western audiences during the war efforts against Vietnam. Or for instance, the Japanese and how they ended up being treated in the United States, placed into concentration camps. This is all because of the fact that we in the West, specifically the Western media, have undermined the humanity of people in places like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like for instance in the past Vietnam or Japan or wherever else we choose to go to war with, so we can forget the millions of people that Western nations have killed all over the world, that they have expelled from their homelands.
This sustained attack left dozens dead and many injured. Babies were among those killed.
They bombed our homes while we were sleeping. All night the airplanes were bombing. About 50 people died. 40 to 50 people were injured. What did these children do wrong?
And we can simply look with tunnel vision at something an official Western enemy is doing wrong and therefore justify killing people in that country and attaching a leadership to the people of a country. That means we can stereotype them. That means we can ban them. That means we can persecute them because they are not part of our civilized world.